morning, everyone. Our theme for today's novena is the Nativity, and it's one that Father Carl and Father Bill assured me would be what they said an easy topic given this time of year. And at first glance, it would certainly seem to be the case. With Christmas less than a week away, as Father Shea mentioned, preaching on this topic should be relatively easy. But yet, I'm not so sure, because the word we focus on today, the theme rather, is the word the Nativity. In comparing the meaning of the words Christmas and Nativity, there are some very subtle but important differences that perhaps we need to reflect upon. That wonderful word Christmas is so powerful a word. It invokes and gives us so many wonderful images and memories. But we all know from our experience that the word Christmas is often trivialized in our society. Certainly we know at this time of year, and well before this time of year, how commercialized this religious feast has become. We hear references to a holiday tree instead of a Christmas tree. We also know that the feast has become rather secularized. Movies and TV shows talk about giving us a Christmas spirit or a Christmas story. But Jesus, Mary, and Joseph are not part of the story, and certainly not part of the spirit of many of these movies, films, TV shows. It's almost as if to say Christmas becomes this general, overall, feel-good type of event, and we can avoid looking at the meaning and the mission of Christmas as we know it as believers of Jesus. Perhaps what we need to do is to pause for a moment, reflect, and try to recapture the meaning of this wonderful feast. And that's why the theme of the Nativity is perfect, because it gets us to focus on, as the phrase says, the reason for the season we celebrate. Let us enter into the beauty for a moment and the mystery of this holy feast and reflect on the meaning of the Nativity. It's a wondrous story of salvation, ever ancient and ever new. It's a story about real people, a past event that is still present today, and a season of hope that fills the world with grace and peace in a time of doubt, fear, and often despair across our globe. First, when we reflect on how easy it is to romanticize the Christmas season, we can also do this with the Nativity. Sometimes we get those wonderful Currier and Ives Christmas cards picturing the ideal Christmas scene, people skating on a pond and a beautiful tree, or a nativity scene that looks picture perfect in a town square. And it's a wonderful thing because we've all experienced some of that in our lives. But the effect can be that sometimes, without meaning to, it can sanitize the real story of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, and what they went through, and what the event was to them. As we know, the Holy Family were real people, poor people. They were people who lived on the margins. They were on the edge, so to speak, of society. Thank God they had a family. Thank God they had a group of people to support them in Nazareth and in Bethlehem, because otherwise they might have perished. Mary's pregnancy was a puzzle and a terrible burden to Joseph at once. And we hear in the Advent season the stories of how how Joseph, and at least initially Mary, neither one understands what is happening and why it is happening. Mary's being with child was a scandal not only to Joseph at first, but to her family and to her neighborhood. Like the Israelites of their era, Mary and Joseph were at the mercy of the elements of that time. There was an oppressive Roman army that taxed them, that could force them to do things they didn't want to do. The very fact that they had to get up and leave their home and go to register in a census. Mary was a young pregnant woman, and they had to travel in a very difficult and precarious area. Shows us the trials and tribulations they went through. We also know the story, and we'll hear the story during the Christmas season, of the flight into Egypt, once King Herod decided to kill the newborn children. Mary and Joseph, with their infant baby, not even a toddler, had to leave the comfortable security of their home and family and flee to Egypt to save Jesus' life. Today, the Holy Family story that we read about, that we pray about, that we hear proclaimed, that story is still about real people all throughout our world today. We know them as refugees. We know them as immigrants. We know them as outsiders. Unfortunately, people even call them intruders. But yet, the stories we hear today of people like the Holy Family remind us of the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, who were instruments of God's salvation, who in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of chaos and unstable conditions, responded to their situations with deep trust and faith in God. The Nativity, I mentioned, is about a past event that's present today. How can that be so? Well, I guess if I wanted to be a historical buff, I could say, well, the very fact that we number our calendar by BC, before Christ, or AD, Anno Domini, after the year of the Lord, tells us that Jesus is the center point of our world, of our civilization, of how we measure and register our time. But that's not just the only thing here. The Nativity, all the events of the Nativity that we've heard about during the Advent season, the very gospel we hear today, is really not only about Mary, Jesus, Joseph, Zechariah, Anna. They're about our lives. The Nativity is a meditation for our whole lives today because it's a beautifully told story of a God who comes to us in a manger, a God who comes to us in a lowly way to raise us up to be his people of hope. The Nativity stories bring us light in a time of year where there's darkness. They bring us the richness of God's grace as we experience the poverty of sin in our world and in our own lives. They bring us acceptance and communion with God in a world of rejection where there is oftentimes seems to be no way out from the problems of the world. And most importantly, they remind us of a God who broke into our world in the person of a vulnerable little child, the incarnation of Jesus. He reminds us that in Jesus we find out who we are because God became one of us and who we can become as we grow in the likeness and image of God through Christ. Like the prophecy we hear on the Sundays during Advent from the book of the prophet Isaiah, we are the people who walked in darkness, but from the events of the Nativity, we see that great light. And it's a light that shines on not only in the past, but in the present and in our world and in our very lives today. One particular way we can focus on the Nativity, as I've been talking about it in kind of a general way, is to look at one specific person who shows us the meaning and the value and the mission of the Nativity. And I think you know who I mean. Speak, of course, of Mary. She shows us par excellence how to live the mystery and the beauty of life as we know it today. And I deliberately use those two words, mystery and beauty, because life is meant to be a mysterious and a beautiful time, even in the midst of difficulties and challenges, even in the midst of problems and pains, many of whom we bring to this novena, because Mary knew that the power of God's Spirit was with her, and that the person of Jesus was within her and would be around her all of her life. And in the story of the Annunciation, we see a wonderful example of that. Mary, at first, when she's told the message by the angel, is uncertain, not sure, but she responds in faith. She says, "I am the maidservant of the Lord. Let it be done to me as you say." Nothing could shake her faith. Mary's yes to God, that she said in that moment, made possible the event we celebrate today. She journeyed with Joseph and she journeyed with Jesus to places unknown, to situations unfamiliar, always with a quiet confidence, always with a deep and abiding faith. She was serene in uncertainty, and she had a deep and abiding faith. And so, my brothers and sisters, as we ponder the Nativity story and we ponder the story of our own lives, let us bring them together by asking Mary to intercede for us today. We place before her in this novena and in this Advent season our hopes, our fears, our worries, and our burdens. As well we should. She is our mother. In this Advent and Nativity of the year 2011, let us once again pray through her intercession that Christ may be born in our hearts and in our lives anew this year. Let us know that, not only in our prayer, but ask her to help us to show that, to know and to show by how we respond to the grace of God, by the way we love and forgive, by the care we show our families, our friends, the needy, and those that God puts in our path. When we do this, whether we know it or not, we become living examples of the Nativity. In this novena, we ask our Blessed Mother to show us how to trust in God and to rely on her Son. Most importantly, by her example as the first disciple and by her intercession for each one of us, we ask Mary to bring us closer to Jesus, who is our way, our truth, and our life.